Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to you all. Very nice to see you here. This session concerns new horizons in research funding, and I'm sure that all of you are aware that there are indeed new horizons. NHMRC, for example, has recently redefined the way in which it proposes to fund research for the future. In the past 5 years, there's been a rejuvenation of interest in research in the New South Wales Ministry of Health with the formation of an Office of Health and Medical Research, and that too has taken serious initiatives in regard to funding of research in the state, and we'll be hearing about that as well. And then third, there's been the advent of Medical Research Future Fund, which is still defining the overall purpose and the parameters within which it will be funding research, but it has particular relevance to the advanced health research translation centres, of which Sydney Health Partners, banner over there describes it in case you haven't heard of it, but we're one of the partners in Western Sydney with Northern and Sydney LHDs and the Children's Hospital Networks and the various affiliated institutes. So three dimensions to the changing horizons in health research, medical research funding. So my expectation is that the majority of people here will be here with a high level of altruistic self-interest. If that's not slightly oxymoronic, well then don't worry, let's move on. But I hope that you'll listen to what's said with a view to addressing the question, what's in it for me? And what can I do to make use of these opportunities to fund the research in which I'm interested in conducting or I'm already conducting? The format of the evening is that we will have an hour together, and my expectation is that the three speakers will occupy probably 40 to 45 minutes of that hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for asking questions. And to start the evening, it's my great pleasure to welcome back to Westmead, as though he never left, Professor Bruce Robinson, former Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, but now in one of his several roles, he's the chairperson of NHMRC. Bruce Robinson.
Thanks very much, Steve. Now, where's the clicker to make the slides change? This is a mystery, is it?
Press an arrow on the keyboard.
Here we go, here's a keyboard, fantastic. Okay, look, there's a keyboard.
Yeah, just hit the arrow.
It does. Okay, so look, thank you very much for having me today. By way of introduction, I should point out that the work that I'm going to be talking about, that is the reform and restructure of the NHMRC grant program, has not been work that I've done. I happen to be the chair of the council of the NHMRC, but this work has really been the child of Anne Kelso, who's the CEO, very capable CEO of the NHMRC, and it's been informed by an expert advisory group that was led by Steve Wessling, who was the Dean of Medicine down at Monash and who's now the Director of SAMRI in Adelaide. There was very clearly a need that was perceived by Council, and that's why we talked to Anne about this, and she readily accepted the challenge, to reform the way NHMRC did its business. You would all be aware of the data that's shown here on this graph. The funding rate declining as the inexorable rise in number of applications for grants rose to over 40% in 2015-2016. And the number of grants that were being able to be funded remained throughout that period relatively static. The MREA, the Medical Research Endowment Account, currently allocates each year about $800 million for research that's supported by NH and MRC each year. That amount of money is set to stay relatively static. There may be slight increases in line with inflation, but there won't be any overall dramatic increase in that amount of money, and that's been incorporated into the budget in the forward estimates. I'm learning more about forward estimates as I spend more and more time in Canberra. Unfortunately, I don't have good news for you in the sense that that amount of money is unchanged. There is, however, a new fund, which Don will be talking more about, the Medical Research Future Fund, which is set to rise ultimately to be dispersing each year an amount somewhat similar to that being dispersed by the MREA, although the mechanism for dispersal of that money is going to be somewhat different. What this slide shows is a system under great pressure. Not only fewer people getting their grants funded, but very large numbers of grants being unfunded and of course all requiring peer review to be categorised as being unfunded, just the same as those that require peer review to get funded. So a lot of time, in essence, being wasted by people putting in applications and being wasted by people reviewing those applications. Very clearly, the NHMRC felt that something had to change. So it undertook a review of the current grant program, particularly to examine the structure of that current program, to consider and then consult on alternative models for development, for the provision of funding for research, and then to develop and workshop a preferred new model. The current grant program, as you know, is essentially comprised of 4 components: fellowships and scholarships, program grants, project grants, and then strategic and leveraging grants. The purpose of each of these is shown there. Clearly there were problems in just one aspect of this, in that fellowships and project grants were funded separately, so it was not unusual. And in fact, in the last couple of years that I was at the university, there were people who got their fellowship but then didn't get their project grant, and there were people who got their project grant but didn't get their fellowship. So the separation of those two grants was the first rather nonsensical aspect of the current grant program. There was also concern expressed by some people, but of course not everyone, that there was an increasing amount of money from the NH and MRC being used to support clinical trials. Clinical trials becoming more and more frequently done and becoming more and more expensive were gradually increasing as a percentage of the total allocation spent on research. The granting entities such as Centres of Research Excellence grants, development grants, partnership centres and targeted calls for research and international collaborative schemes, of course, were all funded out of the 4th pot, the strategic and leveraging grants, and that is one which is set to stay relatively unchanged. The current grant program spent about 50% of its money on project grants, about 20% on the strategic and leveraging grants. Program grants took about 13%, and fellowships and scholarships about 16%. So the objectives of the reform, and this was a set of objectives that were developed by the review team at the conclusion of their review, were essentially threefold. The first was to try to encourage innovation and creativity across all fields of health and medical research. This wasn't a review about trying to fund translational research or health services research or basic research. The idea was to try to encourage innovation and creativity across all of the fields of medical research. It was also thought very important that the reform should particularly provide opportunities for talented researchers at all stages of their career. There was a strong sense that early career researchers in particular struggled often to develop a track record which enabled them to subsequently get funded. And the third objective was to try to minimise the burden on researchers themselves, not only in writing grants but in peer reviewing grants, as I mentioned earlier, thereby freeing up more time for them to actually do research. And it was the trying to fulfil these objectives that led to the new grant program. So the new grant program now has 4 major categories of grant. The first of these is investigator grants. The second is synergy grants. The third are ideas grants, and the fourth are strategic and leveraging grants. The strategic and leveraging grants are relatively unchanged. These are to support research that addresses identified national needs and incorporates the various granting programs that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. What's been changed is the introduction of a category called ideas grants, which are really there to try to support more focused, innovative research projects which address a specific question. And for these particular grants, track record is not so important a component of the overall assessment process. So these are a particularly useful way of a person who's either been out of the workforce for a period of time for one reason or another, or who has not been in the workforce for long, or is starting off, to come along with a good idea that's assessed relatively freshly without a great consideration of their track record. Investigator grants are really focused around people, and I'll go more into those in a moment. And synergy grants, in a sense, are a little bit like the old program grants. They're to support the work of multidisciplinary teams who are working together to answer major questions that couldn't be answered by a single person. The philosophy behind this new grant program is one that funding across the spectrum of health is really important. Investment in people who do have outstanding achievements and promise is important. Innovation is important, and also, of course, we have to meet specific objectives, and from time to time those specific objectives of government do change, and government, of course, always reserves the right to specifically identify areas that it wants people to focus their attention on. And there are areas, you might have seen the recent announcement of the MRFF, antimicrobial resistance, for example, is an area that government specifically would like people to do work in, and will be funded through the recent call that was announced just in the last day or so from the MRFF. So some of the characteristics of these new grant types: first of all, the investigator grant. These are 5-year grants. There's a single chief investigator. The single chief investigator's salary may be incorporated into the grant if they need a salary, but if they're a tenured university person and they don't need a salary, then they can apply only for a research support package. If they do need a salary, though, that salary and the research support package are bundled together in the investigator grant. So a person won't end up with one or the other as they have in the past. I've got to say, I thought that was one of the major failings of the old scheme. I knew people here at Westmead, people at the George Institute, for example, who got their grant but didn't get their fellowship, or who got their fellowship but didn't get their grant. It seemed nonsensical. Synergy grants, large grants. These are grants of a fixed budget of $5 million, 4 to 10 investigators, again for 5 years. Ideas grants, again 5 years, between 1 and 10 investigators. And they're really, the success of these is based upon the idea, and there is a budget requested for research support. It is possible for a person to have salary incorporated in that up to a PSP 5 level. So salary can be obtained through an ideas grant. And then finally, the strategic and leveraging grants, which I've touched on before, incorporate the CREs, development grants, partnership centres, etc. So they are, broadly speaking, the features of the new grant system. One of the other features of the new grant system is capping. This has been slightly controversial, but it's felt that some form of capping is required to try to spread the love. Is that me or you, Tony?
No, that's just somebody trying
to dial in, hack into this presentation. So people are able to hold an investigator grant and a synergy grant, or apply for. They're able to only hold one each of those. A person can hold 2 ideas grants, and the number of strategic and leveraging grants that a person can be involved in are not capped relative to any of the other grant schemes. So in essence, you're capped at 2 grants in any of the first 3 schemes. We expect... Sorry? Oh, it's gone. So that's what... I've been hacked. I wasn't joking, I thought. Okay, so I've talked about capping. I'll talk about the relative amounts of money then that are going to be allocated through these different schemes. The investigator grants will now be allocated a total of about 40% of the $800 million budget. There you go. The ideas grants, 25%. Synergy grants, these are the big ones, the $5 million ones, up to 10 of these a year, 5%. And the strategic and leveraging grants, 30%. So a change in distribution of the allocation of the $800 million under the MREA. The clinical trials allocation I touched on before currently runs at about $60 to $80 million a year through the NHMRC, and that's now going to come out of the strategic and leveraging grants pot. That, of course, has brought joy to some of the people who do more basic or translational research, who feel that clinical trials were gradually consuming more and more of the project grant funding. It's tended to upset some of the people who do clinical trials, who feel as though they're being contained in some way. But nonetheless, that was the recommendation of the Expert Advisory Committee, which was accepted by the NHMRC Council and the Minister, and so they are the new rules. So the things that won't change is that peer review remains the critical basis for the allocation of funding. There is continued commitment to at least 5% of the MREA annually being allocated to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. There remains broad support for broad research in basic clinical public health and health services research. There also remains support for partnership with end users, for people in the commercial sector, and for people who do translation and implementation science. And there remains, of course, support for a diversity of researchers, including both males and females, and for full and part-time researchers and those who are undertaking career breaks. And in particular, that's where the ideas grants we think are going to be very valuable. It's also going to be possible for people who are applying for investigator grants to be applying as part-time researchers through that particular scheme, and also for a person to be part-time on a synergy grant. That won't disadvantage them if they do that. They'll simply apply for a fraction of their salary. So, for example, if a person is a staff specialist who chooses to allocate 50% of their time for research, then they would apply for 50% of their salary through the NHMRC, and the other 50% would be funded through the health department. So we hope that that will give people more flexibility to get part of their salary from one source and part from another. These changes will begin gradually with a plan for the first funding under this scheme to begin in January 2020. The introduction of interim capping arrangements will take place towards the end of this year, and in late 2018, early 2019, applications for funding through these new schemes will be opened, as I said, with a view to those grants being allocated in December 2019 and commenced in early 2020. So this is obviously not something that can be done overnight, because people have to gradually transition from the old grant scheme to the new grant scheme. There is a further presentation that Anne Kelso did as a webcast, which is available on the NHMRC website, that goes into a lot more detail than I've been able to this afternoon. I do know most of the details of what's in that presentation, so hopefully when we come to questions, presumably at the end of this, Steve, I'll be able to help answer some of those for you. Thank you.